In the harsh winter of 1875, a group of lawless men made the fatal mistake of threatening what appeared to be just another settler's wife in the frontier town of Silver Pine. They had no idea that her quiet husband, who spent his days tending their small general store, was once the most feared marksman in the Confederate Army, a man who could extinguish a candle flame from 300 yards with a single shot. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The snow-laden town of Silver Pine hadn't seen much excitement since the copper mines began to falter 2 years ago. The once bustling streets now lay quiet, broken only by the occasional crunch of boots through fresh snow and the distant howl of winter winds through the mountain passes. So when Eleanor Mason started expanding her husband's modest general store, adding imported fabrics and fine goods from the back east, it drew attention. Some welcome, some not. Eleanor was a striking woman in her early 30s, with auburn hair usually tied back in a practical bun and eyes that held both warmth and determination. Her quick mind for business and gentle way with customers had helped transform Mason's General Goods from a simple supply stop into something approaching a proper department store, despite the town's declining fortunes. Most folks in Silver Pine knew her as a friendly face behind the counter, always ready with a kind word or a bit of helpful advice. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that the quiet man who kept the books in the back room, Michael Mason, had earned a different kind of reputation during the war. Under the name Ghost Shot Mason, he'd become a legend among Confederate sharpshooters, known for making impossible shots with deadly accuracy. The kind of man other snipers whispered about around campfires, whose mere presence could keep entire Union companies pinned down for days. The afternoon that would change everything started like any other. Eleanor was arranging a new display of imported silk ribbons when the bell above the door chimed. 3 men entered, tracking snow and mud onto her clean floors. She recognized them as part of the Hawkins gang, rough men who'd been causing trouble up and down the territory since the mines started closing. "Well, well," drawled the tallest one, a scarred man known as Buck Hawkins. "Ain't this just the prettiest little shop?" His voice carried a mocking edge that made Eleanor's spine stiffen. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, but something in Buck's eyes set off warning bells. "Welcome to Mason's," she said evenly, keeping her voice professional. "Can I help you find anything specific?" Buck's companions spread out, one moving toward the back of the store, the other lingering near the front window. They didn't look like men interested in shopping. "Heard you've been bringing in some mighty fine goods," Buck said, running a dirty finger along a shelf of imported tea tins. "Expensive stuff. Must be turning quite a profit." "We do well enough," Eleanor replied carefully. She was aware of Michael, in the back room, probably already alerted by the men's heavy footsteps. They'd discussed this possibility, trouble finding its way to their door. The territory was growing more desperate as the mines failed, leaving too many men with too few honest ways to make a living. "Thing is," Buck continued, his pretense at friendliness dropping away, "times being what they are, businesses need protection. Insurance, you might say, against accidents." He knocked a tin deliberately to the floor, the crash making Eleanor jump slightly. The man by the window chuckled darkly. "Lot of accidents happening lately. Fires, break-ins, terrible shame." Eleanor's hand moved slightly toward the counter, where she kept a small derringer, a gift from Michael, though he'd hoped she'd never need it. "I think you should leave," she said firmly. Buck's face hardened. "Now that ain't very hospitable, Mrs. Mason. We're just having a friendly business discussion. Ain't that right, boys?" His hand came to rest on the gun at his hip, a deliberate gesture. "The lady asked you to leave." Michael's quiet voice came from the doorway to the back room. Eleanor hadn't even heard him approach, but there he stood, lean and unassuming in his shopkeeper's apron. To most eyes, he looked harmless, a man more suited to counting inventory than confrontation. Buck turned, clearly amused by what he saw as little threat. "This ain't your concern, old man. Best mind your own business." "My wife is my business," Michael replied, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made Eleanor's breath catch. She knew that tone. She'd heard it once before, years ago. When a drunk had gotten too friendly at their previous store in Tennessee, the man who'd moved to the back of the store was now between Michael and Buck, his hand hovering near his gun. "Boss, this is taking too long. Let's just show them what happens to folks who don't appreciate our protection." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion to Eleanor's eyes. The man reached for his gun, a movement that should have given him every advantage. But Michael's hand moved with a speed that defied belief, producing a Remington 1858 that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The first shot caught the reaching man in the shoulder before his fingers even touched his holster, spinning him into a display of canned goods. Buck went for his gun, but Michael's second shot knocked it cleanly from his hand, taking a finger with it. The man by the window managed to draw, but his shot went wild as Michael's third round took him in the gun arm. All three shots had happened in the space of heartbeats, the sound still echoing off the walls. "Jesus Christ," Buck gasped, cradling his bleeding hand. You're him. Ghost shot Mason." "I was," Michael acknowledged quietly, his gun still trained steadily on Buck's chest. "Now I'm just a shopkeeper who wants to live in peace with his wife. But if you force my hand, Mr. Hawkins, I'll show you exactly how I earned that name." The wounded men scrambled to their feet, helping their shocked leader toward the door. "This ain't over," Buck snarled, though fear had replaced the mockery in his voice. "It can be," Michael replied. "Leave Silver Pine, don't come back, or next time I won't aim for extremities." After they fled, Eleanor quickly locked the door and turned the sign to closed. Her hands were shaking slightly as she began picking up the scattered merchandise. Michael holstered his revolver and moved to help her, his movements precise and economical as always. "They'll be back," she said softly. "With more men?" "Yes," Michael agreed, gathering broken glass from the floor. "But now they'll come carefully, and that's when they make mistakes." Eleanor touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You wanted to leave the war behind." "I did. I do." He covered her hand with his. "But some things are worth fighting for. You built something good here, Eleanor. Something honest. I won't let them destroy that." As they cleaned in silence, snow continuing to fall outside their window, both knew that Silver Pine was about to discover why Ghost Shot Mason had been the most feared sharpshooter in the entire Confederate Army. The real trouble hadn't even begun. Sheriff Thomas Blackburn arrived within the hour, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the scene. Blood still stained the wooden floor where Buck's men had fallen, though Eleanor had managed to clean most of it. "3 shots," he said quietly, examining the bullet holes in the wall. "Clean through your arms and shoulders, defensive wounds." His eyes met Michael's. "Not many men can shoot like that." "Not many need to," Michael replied, continuing to reorganize his ledger as if nothing had happened. But Eleanor noticed how his fingers lingered near the Remington, now tucked beneath the counter. The sheriff nodded slowly. "I heard rumors during the war. Ghost shot Mason. They said you could hit a running man at 800 yards. That true?" "Depends on the wind," Michael answered without looking up. Blackburn removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. "Buck Hawkins isn't just some local troublemaker. He's connected. His brother runs most of the territory north of here, Wesley Hawkins. They call him the Wolf of Wyoming on account of how he hunts down folks who cross him. Then perhaps it's time someone reminded the wolves that men invented rifles for a reason." Eleanor spoke up, her voice firm. Both men turned to look at her, and she lifted her chin. "We built something here, Sheriff, a legitimate business that helps this town. I won't let criminals take that from us." "Brave words, Mrs. Mason," the sheriff sighed. "But Wesley Hawkins has 50 men at his call, professional killers, most of them, and now you've wounded his brother." "Numbers don't matter much to a good marksman," Michael said quietly. "A rifle doesn't care how many friends you have." Before the sheriff could respond, young Jimmy Wells burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement and cold. Jimmy worked at the telegraph office, and news traveled through him faster than winter wind through mountain passes. "Sheriff, Mr. Mason," he gasped. "Buck Hawkins and his men. They just rode north, but before they left, they sent a telegram to Wesley. I saw what it said." Blackburn's face darkened. "Out with it, boy. It said, 'Ghost shot Mason in Silver Pine. Shoot me up bad. Bring everyone.'" Jimmy swallowed hard. Then they added something else, said, "Wife runs the store, soft target." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eleanor watched her husband carefully, saw the subtle shift in his posture that most would miss. To others, he might have appeared calm, even unconcerned, but she knew better. She'd seen this transformation once before, years ago, when he'd briefly become the man he'd been during the war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Jimmy," Michael said softly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that makes wise men tremble, "I need you to send a telegram for me." "Yes, sir." The boy pulled out his notebook with shaking hands. "To Wesley Hawkins. Message reads, 'I once shot 32 men in a single day at Chickamauga. All of them were better than you. Come prove me wrong.'" Michael paused. "Sign it, Ghost Shot." The sheriff cursed under his breath. "You're calling him out? The man has an army." "No," Michael replied, finally looking up from his ledger. His eyes had changed, becoming distant, calculating. Eleanor recognized this look, the face of a man measuring distances, calculating windage, seeing the world as a series of angles and trajectories. "I'm giving him a choice. He can either stay away and keep his reputation, or he can come here and lose it. So along with anything else I decide to take from him." Eleanor moved to stand beside her husband, her hand finding his. "We'll need to prepare," she said practically. "The store has good sight lines, but the upper windows would give better angles." Michael nodded. "Sheriff, I suggest you get your deputy out of town for a few days. What's coming isn't law enforcement business." "Everything in my town is my business," Blackburn protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen the look in Michael's eyes too. "Then help me protect it," Michael said simply. "Because one way or another, Silver Pine is about to see what happens when wolves try to hunt a ghost." As the sheriff left to make his preparations, Eleanor began taking inventory of their ammunition supplies. She'd learned long ago that loving a legend meant accepting both the man and the myth. Ghost Shot Mason had been her husband's past, but now it seemed that past would become their future. Michael returned to his ledger, but now his calculations had nothing to do with merchandise and everything to do with range, tables, and firing positions. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Silver Pine in a blank white canvas. Soon enough, that canvas would be painted with whatever colors fate and gunpowder decided. The real war was about to begin. Word of Ghost Shot. Mason's presence in Silver Pine spread through the territory like wildfire. By nightfall, the town had grown unnaturally quiet, its streets empty, save for the occasional whisper of wind through fresh fallen snow. Folks who'd known Michael Mason only as the quiet bookkeeper now looked at their general store with new eyes, wondering what other secrets lay behind its frost-covered windows. Dr. Sarah Collins was the first to offer help, arriving at the store's back door with her medical bag and a determined expression. The town's only physician had treated enough gunshot wounds to know what was coming. "I won't leave," she declared before Eleanor could speak. "Someone needs to be ready when the shooting starts." Eleanor welcomed her in, noting how the doctor's eyes immediately went to the defensive positions Michael had begun preparing. He'd moved display cases to create cover, calculated firing lanes, and was now checking sight lines from the store's upper windows. They'd closed early, using the fading daylight to transform their business into a fortress. "Wesley Hawkins won't come alone," Sarah said, organizing her medical supplies on a back counter. "I treated some of his men last year when they passed through. Professional killers, every one of them. Cold as mountain ice." "How many?" Eleanor asked, helping the doctor. "Arrange bandages. I counted 12 that time. Word is, he has at least 4 times that many now." Sarah paused, looking at Eleanor carefully. "They say he once burned down an entire town in Montana because the sheriff there refused to pay protection money. Didn't leave anyone alive to tell the tale. That's the trouble with wolves." Michael's quiet voice came from the stairs as he descended. "They think numbers make them invincible, makes them careless." He carried his old sharpshooting rifle, a custom Whitworth he'd used during the war. The British-made weapon had an octagonal barrel and a scope that could pick out targets at distances. Other men couldn't even see clearly. "Samuel Whitaker came by while you were upstairs," Eleanor told him. "Says he was a scout during the war, offered to help watch the approaches to town." Michael nodded. "Good man, solid eyes, used to guide supply, wagons through Union lines at night." He began methodically cleaning the Whitworth, his movements precise and practiced. "We'll need those eyes. Wesley's men will try to surround us under cover of darkness." A knock at the door made them all tense, but it was only Frank Chen, the owner of Silver Pines Laundry. His family had helped build the railroad through the territory, staying on to establish businesses in the growing towns. "Mr. Mason," he said, bowing slightly. "My father wished me to remind you that our building overlooks the main street. Its roof would provide excellent," he smiled thinly, "observation opportunities." "Your father was a military man?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "He fought warlords in China before coming to America," Frank replied. "He says a good position matters more than a good weapon. Our roof is yours if you want it." More visitors came as evening deepened. Martin O'Reilly, who'd lost his mind to Wesley Hawkins's schemes, offered information about the northern trails. Rebecca Hawthorne, the schoolteacher, brought detailed maps of the town and surrounding areas that she used to teach geography. Even old Pete Sullivan, the undertaker, shuffled in with practical advice about which buildings had the sturdiest walls. "Never thought I'd see Silver Pine pull together like this," Sheriff Blackburn remarked, returning from his rounds. "Town's been half dead since the mines started failing. Sometimes it takes a threat to remind people what they're willing to fight for," Eleanor said, but her attention was on Michael. He stood by the window, watching the snow fall, his expression distant. She recognized that look. He was already fighting the battle in his mind, seeing angles and trajectories, calculating every possibility. "They're coming," he said suddenly, turning from the window. "2 riders, from the north, scouts." "Sheriff." Blackburn moved to look, squinting into the gathering darkness. "I don't see anything." "You won't, not yet, but they're there." Michael picked up the Whitworth. "Time for Ghost Shot to remind them why they gave me that name." Eleanor touched his arm. "You don't have to be him again. We could leave, start fresh somewhere else." Michael covered her hand with his. "Running just tells men like Wesley Hawkins they're right, that fear and violence can take whatever they want." He smiled slightly. "Besides, you built something beautiful here. Sometimes beautiful things need protecting." A shot rang out from the northern edge of town, one of the scouts firing at a shadow probably. The bullet went wide, shattering a window down the street. Michael's response was a single report from the Whitworth. In the silence that followed, they heard a horse running away, riderless. "Warning shot?" Sheriff Blackburn asked. "No." Michael was already reloading. That was the message. The next ones start counting. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She remembered the first time she'd seen this side of her husband years ago during their courtship. She'd been visiting her uncle's ranch when raiders attacked. Michael had been there as a guest, the quiet veteran who helped with the books. She'd watched in awe as he picked off 8 raiders without missing a shot, some at distances that seemed impossible. That night, he'd told her everything, about Ghost Shot, about Chickamauga, about the toll that kind of killing took on a man's soul. She'd held him while he shook with the memories, and later, when he proposed, she'd promised to help him build a life where those skills would never be needed again. But now, watching him sight down the Whitworth's barrel at another unseen target, she realized some ghosts never truly rest. Sometimes they wait, patient as winter frost, for the moment when they're needed again. "Second scouts pulling back," Michael reported. "They'll have seen the first horse return empty. Wesley will know." "I haven't lost my touch." "What now?" Sarah asked, her medical bag ready. "Now we wait. Wesley's pride won't let him back down, but he's not fool enough to attack at night, not against a sharpshooter who knows the ground." Michael began organizing his ammunition with methodical precision. "He'll come at dawn thinking the rising sun will blind me." "How many men?" Sheriff Blackburn pressed. "If he's as angry as I think, he'll bring everyone. 50, maybe more." Michael's voice remained calm, as if discussing a routine inventory. "Numbers won't matter. A rifle doesn't care about odds." Eleanor watched the others absorb this. She saw fear in their eyes, but something else too. Hope, maybe, or determination. Silver Pine had been dying slowly, strangled by men like Wesley Hawkins, who preyed on weakness and despair. Maybe it was time for a ghost from the war to remind everyone that some things were worth fighting for. "I'll need everyone out of the store before midnight," Michael announced. "The upper floor is going to be my primary position, but I'll have others prepared. Anyone still here will be a distraction." "I'm staying," Eleanor said firmly. When Michael started to protest, she held up her hand. "This is my store too. I can reload and spot targets as well as anyone. You taught me yourself." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "The rest of you, spread the word. Keep everyone inside tomorrow. What's coming isn't for the faint of heart." As their visitors departed, Eleanor began preparing food and coffee for the long night ahead. Through the windows, she could see lights going out all over Silver Pine as the town battened down for the storm to come. Not the one that had been dropping snow all day, but the one that would arrive with the dawn, carried on waves of gunpowder and led by a man they called the Wolf of Wyoming. Michael returned to his calculations and preparations, but not before touching the locket he wore. Under his shirt, the one that contained a photograph of their wedding day. Eleanor smiled, remembering his words from that happy afternoon. "The war gave me a name, but you gave me a reason to forget it." Now it seemed the war name and the reason would have to coexist. Ghost Shot Mason was awakening from his long slumber, called forth by the need to protect everything they'd built together. Tomorrow would show Silver Pine and Wesley Hawkins exactly why that name had once made even the bravest soldiers tremble. The real ghost story was about to begin. As midnight approached, Frank Chen returned with unexpected news. "Riders coming from the east," he reported, his breath visible in the cold air. "Not Hawkins's men, different, military precision." Michael moved to the window, Whitworth cradled in his arms. Through his scope, he studied the approaching riders, their movements illuminated by the moon on snow. "Interesting," he murmured, "very interesting. What is it?" Eleanor asked, recognizing the subtle shift in his posture. "Pinkerton agents," he replied. 5 of them. Agency's been hunting Wesley Hawkins for months. Railroad robberies, protection rackets, murder." He lowered the rifle. "This just got More complicated. The Pinkerton men entered town quietly, their horses' hooves muffled by fresh snow. Their leader, a sharp-faced man named Daniel Burke, requested a meeting at the sheriff's office. Michael and Eleanor attended, along with Sheriff Blackburn. "We've been tracking Hawkins for 6 months, Burke explained, spreading documents across the sheriff's desk. He's escalated from simple extortion to wholesale terrorism. That town in Montana wasn't his first, and it won't be his last unless we stop him." "Why here? Why now?" Sheriff Blackburn demanded. Burke's eyes fixed on Michael. "Because Ghost Shot Mason just gave us an opportunity we couldn't have planned better. Hawkins's pride won't let him back down from a challenge, especially not from a legendary sharpshooter. He'll come in force, commit all his resources to one location." "You want to use us as bait," Eleanor realized, her voice hard. "We want to end Wesley Hawkins," Burke corrected. "We have 30 agents positioned in the surrounding hills. When he commits his forces to attacking the town, we'll cut off his retreat. A proper military-style operation." Michael had been silent, studying the Pinkertons' maps and plans. "Your men are in the wrong positions," he said finally. "Hawkins won't come up the main valley. He'll split his forces, try to envelope the town from multiple directions. Your current positions will be useless." Burke bristled slightly. "We've planned this carefully." "You've planned it like lawmen," Michael interrupted. "Think like a wolf. He'll have men come in through the old mining trails to the northwest, others through the cedar break to the southeast. He'll want to control the high ground first, establish crossfire positions." "And how would you counter that?" Burke asked, professional interest overcoming his irritation. Michael smiled thinly. "I wouldn't. I'd let him think his plan was working. Let him commit his forces, spread them out trying to surround us. That's when they become vulnerable." "To what? One man with a rifle?" Burke scoffed. "To one ghost," Michael corrected quietly. "Who knows every shadow in this valley, every angle, every distance? A man thinking about surrounding his enemy isn't thinking about being hunted himself." Eleanor watched the Pinkerton agent absorb this. She saw the moment he understood, really understood, who he was dealing with. The legends of Ghost Shot Mason weren't just campfire stories. They were warnings. "We'll adjust our positions," Burke conceded. "But we'll need coordination, signals." "Use the church bell," Eleanor suggested. "One toll for forces from the north, 2 for south, 3 for west. It'll sound natural enough. People expect bells in a Christian town." The meeting continued past 1 a.m., strategies being refined, positions adjusted. Through it all, Eleanor watched her husband slowly transforming. The quiet bookkeeper was fading, replaced by something older, deadlier. She saw it in how he moved, how his eyes constantly tracked sightlines and firing positions even during conversation. When they finally returned to the store, the sky was beginning to lighten with false dawn. Michael immediately went to check his weapons one final time, but Eleanor caught his arm. "When this is over," she said softly, "when the wolves are gone and the ghosts can rest again, promise me we'll still have our quiet life." He touched her face gently. "Everything I do, everything I've ever done, has been to protect the chance for that quiet life. The ghost is just a tool, Eleanor. You have my heart." They spent the remaining dark hours in preparation. Michael moved between his chosen positions, memorizing every detail, every distance. Eleanor prepared ammunition and checked their supplies. Outside, Silver Pine held its breath, waiting for dawn and whatever violence it would bring. The wolf was coming to hunt a ghost, not knowing that ghosts could hunt too. And this ghost had something wolves never truly understand, something worth fighting for beyond mere survival or pride. Tomorrow would belong to the living or the dead. But tonight belonged to a man and woman who'd built a life between war and peace, and the love that made both states bearable. Dawn broke over Silver Pine like a fever, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of bloody crimson. Michael Mason stood at his highest vantage point, the church tower he'd prepared the night before, and watched the sun rise through his Whitworth scope. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight, turning the recent snowfall into a crust of ice that would crunch underfoot, a natural early warning system against anyone trying to move stealthily. "Riders," Eleanor whispered from beside him. She'd insisted on serving as his spotter, her eyes nearly as sharp as his own, after years of watching him practice. "Northwest Trail, just where you said they'd come." Michael adjusted his scope slightly. Through it he could see them clearly, advanced scouts for Wesley Hawkins's main force, moving cautiously through the tree line. Their breath fogged in the morning air as they studied the seemingly empty town through binoculars. 800 yards, he murmured, making minute adjustments to his sight. Wind from the northeast about 3 knots, temperature near zero. These weren't just observations, they were calculations, factors that would affect a bullet's path over such a distance. "You don't have to take this shot," Eleanor said softly. "They're just scouts. We could let them report back." Michael's finger rested lightly on the trigger. What would they report? That the town is quiet? That Ghost Shot Mason is all talk? He exhaled slowly. "No, Wesley Hawkins needs to understand exactly what he's riding into." Whitworth's report shattered the morning silence. Through his scope, Michael watched the leftmost scout topple from his saddle, a clean shot through his shoulder. Before the echo had faded, a second shot caught another scout's horse, sending both mount and rider tumbling on the icy ground. The remaining scouts scattered, their practiced formation dissolving into panic. They weren't ready for that range, Eleanor observed, lowering her binoculars. "No one shoots accurately at 800 yards. Ghost Shot does." Michael was already reloading, his movements precise despite the cold. And now they know it wasn't just wartime propaganda. From their position, they could see the Pinkerton agents adjusting their hidden positions in response to the scouts' retreat. Burke had taken Michael's advice about deployment, spreading his men through the surrounding high ground rather than clustering them in the valley approaches. It was a good strategy, but Michael knew it wouldn't be enough. Wesley Hawkins hadn't survived this long by being predictable. The church bell tolled once, signal from Frank Chen, that more riders were approaching from the north. This would be the main force. Michael and Eleanor quickly moved to their secondary position, a reinforced window in the general store's upper floor that offered clear views of the town's northern approach. "God almighty," Eleanor breathed as she counted the approaching riders. "There must be 60 of them." 63, Michael corrected, already calculating angles and fields of fire, plus whatever forces he's holding in reserve. More than we expected. He glanced at his wife. "Last chance to leave, Eleanor. Take the back trails south. I can hold them here." Eleanor checked the loads in her Spencer carbine, a weapon she'd learned to use well over the years. "My place is here. Someone has to watch your back while you're watching everything else." Before Michael could respond, movement caught his eye. A single rider was approaching down the main street, a white flag held high. Even at this distance, the resemblance to Buck Hawkins was clear. This would be Wesley himself coming to parley. "Brave of him," Eleanor remarked, "or foolish." "Calculated," Michael replied. "He knows I won't shoot a man under a flag of truce. That would spoil the story he needs to tell later about how he gave the famous Ghost Shot every chance to surrender. Before destroying him, Sheriff Blackburn met Wesley Hawkins in the street, the two men's breath fogging in the cold air. Even from their position, they could hear Wesley's voice carrying clearly. He wanted to be heard. "Come out, Ghost Shot," he called, his tone almost jovial. "Let's discuss this like gentlemen before things get messy. My brother made a mistake, but surely we can reach an accommodation." Michael's response was to put a shot into the snow beside Wesley's horse, close enough to make the animal dance nervously. The message was clear. "I could kill you where you stand, but I'm choosing not to." Wesley's laugh carried through the cold air. "Still the marksman, I see. But can you watch every angle at once?" I have men surrounding this town. They'll burn it. Or to the ground on my order. All because you couldn't let one little protection racket slide. It's not about the protection money, Michael called back, his quiet voice somehow carrying just as far. It's about men like you thinking fear gives you ownership. This town belongs to its people. People? Wesley spread his arms, indicating the empty streets. I don't see any people, Ghost Shot. I see cowards hiding behind locked doors while you play hero. How many innocent folks are you willing to sacrifice for your principles? Eleanor touched Michael's arm as movement caught her eye. Southeast corner, she whispered. They're trying to flank around behind the livery stable. Michael nodded slightly. He'd been expecting this. Wesley's parley was just a distraction. Signal, Burke, he murmured. Tell him they're moving exactly as we predicted. Eleanor struck a match and held it in the window briefly. A simple signal to the hidden Pinkerton agents that the trap was being baited. Through her binoculars, she could see answering flashes from concealed positions. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Last chance, Mason, Wesley called out. Surrender now. Leave town with your wife, and we'll let bygones be bygones. Fight, and I'll paint these streets red. Michael's response was another shot, this one taking Wesley's hat cleanly off his head. The Wolf of Wyoming didn't even flinch. A brave man, whatever else he might be. Have it your way, then, Wesley said, his voice hardening as he turned his horse. Their blood is on your hands. As Wesley rode back to his men, Michael quickly moved positions, heading for the church tower again. This time, Eleanor stayed in the store. They'd prepared multiple firing positions, planning to make Ghost Shot seem like a phantom that could strike from anywhere. The attack, when it came, was brutally coordinated. Riders charged from multiple directions, guns blazing at every window and doorway, but Michael had predicted this too. His first shot caught the leader of the southeast flanking group in the leg, disrupting their entire formation. His second dropped a man trying to set up a heavy buffalo gun that could have penetrated the store's reinforced walls. Eleanor, watching from her position, felt a fierce pride as she saw her husband's strategy unfold. Every shot was placed not just to wound or kill, but to create maximum chaos and confusion. Wesley's men, expecting to face resistance from ground-level positions, found themselves under fire from high angles they hadn't prepared for. But Wesley Hawkins hadn't earned his reputation by giving up easily. Even as his first attack faltered, Eleanor could see him organizing a second wave. And this time, some of his men were carrying something that made her blood run cold. Dynamite. Real battle for Silver Pine was about to begin, and not even Ghost Shot Mason could be everywhere at once. Fire in the hole! The shout came from Wesley's men as they hurled the first stick of dynamite. It landed near the general store's foundation, but Eleanor was ready. She'd prepared for this, having seen similar tactics during their time in mining. And towns. Using a long pole with a hook, she swept the explosive away from the building before it could detonate. The blast shook the street, but did no damage to their defenses. Good girl, Michael murmured from his position, pride evident in his voice. His Whitworth cracked again, taking down another dynamite-wielding attacker, but there were more coming, and Wesley was learning. His men were using the explosions as cover, moving from building to building during the confusion. The church bell rang twice. Frank Chen's signal that enemies were approaching from a new direction. Through the swirling gun smoke, Eleanor caught glimpses of men setting up firing positions in the abandoned mining office across the street. If they got established there, they could pin down anyone trying to move between the store and church. Michael, she called through their prepared speaking tube. Mining office, I see them. His voice came back calm as ever. But Wesley's watching for my shot. He's got men ready to mark my position as soon as I fire. Eleanor made a quick decision. I'll create a distraction. When their attention shifts, take them out. Before Michael could protest, she had already moved to execute her plan. Using a series of ropes they'd prepared, Eleanor lowered a store mannequin from a side window. In the chaos and smoke, it looked enough like a person trying to escape that. Several of Wesley's men took the bait, opening fire on it. Michael's shot, when it came, was devastating. 3 rapid-fire rounds that cleared the mining office before the enemy sharpshooters could establish their position. But Wesley was far from finished. A new sound cut through the gunfire. The heavy wheels of a wagon being pulled by straining horses. Eleanor's heart sank as she saw what they were bringing up, a small cannon likely stolen from a military patrol. "They have artillery," she reported through the speaking tube. "Looks like a 12-pound mountain howitzer." Michael's response was grim. "That changes things. That cannon could bring down the entire building. Signal Burke. This needs to happen now." Eleanor struck 2 matches this time, the signal for the Pinkerton agents to begin their part of the plan. But as she waited for their response, something felt wrong. The answering signals didn't come from all the expected positions. "Michael," she called urgently, "I think some of the Pinkerton positions have been compromised." A new voice confirmed her fears. Daniel Burke himself appeared at their back door, bleeding from a head wound. "Hawkins knew we were coming," he gasped as Eleanor let him in. "He had men in place before we ever arrived. Half my agents are dead or captured." The situation had just gotten drastically worse. Their entire strategy had relied on the Pinkertons cutting off Wesley's escape routes and preventing him from bringing up heavy weapons. Now they were facing both problems at once. Through the speaking tube, Eleanor heard Michael's steady voice. "New plan. Eleanor, get the coal oil from the basement. Burke, if you can still shoot, I need you watching the back approaches. We're going to show Wesley why they call me Ghost Shot, not Dead Shot." As Eleanor hurried to retrieve the coal oil, she could hear Wesley's voice booming outside again. "Time to end this, Mason. You've got 10 minutes to surrender before we open up with the cannon. There won't be enough left of your store to fill." "A matchbox." Michael's response was a shot that disabled the cannon's elevation mechanism, followed by another that took out its sighting scope. Impressive shooting, but Wesley had planned for this too. His men quickly threw a tarp over the weapon, protecting it from further precision shots, while they repaired what they could. "5 minutes, Ghost Shot," Wesley called. "Don't make me kill everyone in this town just to get to you." Eleanor worked quickly, positioning the coal oil barrels according to Michael's instructions. She understood his plan now. They weren't just defending anymore. They were setting up for something bigger. "Burke," Michael's voice came through the tube. "Get ready to move fast. Eleanor, on my signal, soak the back room and be prepared to light it. They think they're forcing us into a corner, but they're walking into a trap." "What about the townspeople?" Burke demanded. "If this spreads—" "Frank Chen's family has been evacuating them through the laundry tunnels for the past hour," Eleanor explained. Michael saw this coming. He always sees it coming. Outside, Wesley's men were finishing their cannon repairs. The tarp came off, revealing the weapon ready to fire. Wesley himself was sighting down its barrel, aiming for the store's main support pillars. "Time's up, Mason! Last chance!" Michael's voice came back strong and clear. "You know what your mistake was, Wesley. Same as every other man who thought numbers could beat skill. You spent so much time trying to surround us." There was a pause as Whitworth cracked one final time. "That you forgot to watch your own back." The shot struck a hidden barrel of blasting powder that Wesley's men had brought up for the cannon. The explosion was massive, scattering men and horses. In the chaos that followed, Eleanor heard Michael's command through the tube. "Now!" The real Ghost Shot was about to show himself, and Wesley Hawkins was about to learn why some legends are better left alone. The explosion at the cannon transformed the battlefield in an instant. Through the smoke and chaos, Wesley's men struggled to regroup, their coordinated attack dissolving into confusion. But Michael Mason was just getting started. Ghost Shot was about to earn his name all over again. Eleanor lit the coal oil in the store's back room, sending thick black smoke billowing into the winter air. To Wesley's men, it would appear that their cannon had struck true, that the store was burning. She could hear their cheers of victory, premature celebrations that would soon turn to something else entirely. Moving to position 3, Michael's voice came through the speaking tube. In the confusion, he'd already slipped out of the church. Tower through a route they'd prepared, Ghost Shot was now mobile, and that's when he was most deadly. The first sign that something was wrong came when Wesley's men tried to advance on the burning store. A shot rang out from the Chinese laundry's roof, an impossible position, given that they'd just seen muzzle flashes from the church tower. Seconds ago, 2 more men fell, clutching wounded legs. "He's on the roof," someone shouted. Gunfire concentrated on Frank Chen's building, but another shot came from a completely different direction, the abandoned mining office, dropping a man trying to set up a second artillery piece. How is he moving so fast? Wesley's voice carried clear frustration. Find him! But Michael had prepared for this moment meticulously. The store's apparent burning was creating a smokescreen across the middle of town. He'd established multiple hidden routes between key positions, using the town's old drainage tunnels and connecting buildings. To Wesley's men, it would seem like Ghost Shot was everywhere at once. Eleanor coordinated from their fallback position in the store's reinforced basement, using their network of speaking tubes to guide Michael's movements. "They're splitting up," she reported. "Small teams trying to search buildings systematically." "Perfect," Michael's voice came back, now from somewhere near the livery stable. "That's exactly what we want. Burke, are you in position?" The Pinkerton agent, who'd recovered some of his strength, confirmed from his hidden spot near the town's water tower. He'd managed to contact 3 of his surviving agents, positioning them to support Michael's plan. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Michael began picking off Wesley's search teams with surgical precision, never killing, but wounding just severely enough to take men out of the fight. Each shot came from a different position, creating the impression of multiple sharpshooters. "Working in concert. Southeast team down," Eleanor reported, watching through a periscope they'd mounted in a basement window. "They're starting to bunch up just like you predicted." Wesley was no fool. He quickly realized his men were being herded into a trap, but knowledge didn't equal prevention. Every time he tried to reorganize his forces, precision fire would disrupt their movements, forcing them to cluster in increasingly vulnerable positions. "Enough!" Wesley's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Mason, you want to play ghost? Let's see how your tricks work against this." He gave a signal, and several men rushed forward with glass bottles, improvised incendiary devices. "They're going to try to burn us out for real this time," Eleanor warned. But Michael had anticipated this too. "Signal Frank," he instructed. "It's time for the dragon's breath." Eleanor struck 3 matches in rapid succession, their preset signal. Moments later, the town's water tower burst open, releasing a torrent that instantly froze in the winter air, creating a barrier of ice between Wesley's men and their primary targets. Several attackers slipped and fell, their incendiary devices shattering harmlessly. "Impossible!" Wesley raged. "How many men do you have?" Michael's response was another shot that severed Wesley's gun belt clean off his waist. "Just one ghost," his voice echoed from somewhere in the smoke. "But that's all I've ever needed." The tide had turned. Wesley's men, demoralized and disoriented, were beginning to fall back. Those who'd witnessed Ghost Shot's reputation during the war were spreading whispered warnings among their companions. This wasn't just a sharpshooter. This was something else entirely, but Wesley Hawkins hadn't earned his reputation by accepting defeat easily. Eleanor, watching through the periscope, saw him pull something from his saddlebag, a map. Her breath caught as she realized what it must be. "Michael," she called urgently through the speaking tube. "He's going to use it," Wesley's voice confirmed. Her fears, "Mason, you've prepared well for this fight, I'll give you that. But did you prepare the old mining tunnels, the ones that run right under half these buildings?" Michael's response was silence. For the first time that day, Ghost Shot didn't have an immediate answer. "That's right," Wesley continued, savage satisfaction in his voice. "I did my homework too. This town was built on silver mines, and I know. Every shaft, every support beam, one well-placed charge, and half your carefully prepared positions collapse into the earth." Through the speaking tube, Eleanor heard Michael's measured breathing. He was calculating, planning, just as he had at Chickamauga when surrounded by superior forces. "You're bluffing," Michael called back. "Those tunnels were sealed years ago." Wesley laughed. "Were they? Ask your wife about the shipment of mining supplies her store received last month, the ones marked as general goods, but actually contained blasting caps and fuses." Eleanor's heart stopped. She remembered the shipment, had even commented on its unusual weight. But she'd trusted their regular supplier, never thinking to check the contents thoroughly. "You've had men in town for weeks," Michael realized aloud, "preparing for this. Since the moment Buck sent word about a quiet shopkeeper with suspiciously steady hands," Wesley confirmed. "I don't leave things to chance, Ghost Shot. Now let's discuss surrender again. Your reputation against my word that this town doesn't become a sinkhole. The stakes had just changed dramatically. Michael Mason's skills with a rifle couldn't protect against an enemy that would strike from below. Ghost Shot was about to face his greatest challenge yet, one that would require more than just legendary marksmanship to overcome. 2 minutes, Mason," Wesley called out. "Then I start bringing this town down around your ears, one building at a time." Eleanor's mind raced as she reviewed their options through the periscope. Wesley's men had positioned themselves near known mine entrance points, ready to descend. The threat was real. She could see the telltale bulge of explosive charges in their packs. "Michael," she whispered through the speaking tube, "the Chinese laundry. Remember what Frank's father said about the tunnels beneath it?" There was a moment of silence, then she heard the smile in Michael's voice. "The cave-in of 68, of course." Another pause, as he calculated. "But we'd need to time it perfectly. If we're off by even a few seconds, then we'd better not be off," Eleanor replied firmly. She switched to another tube. "Burke, can your remaining men create a distraction to the north? We need Wesley's attention split." "Consider it done," the Pinkerton agent replied. Moments later, shots rang out from the north end of town, drawing some of Wesley's men in that direction. "Time's up, Ghost Shot," Wesley announced. "Last chance before." His ultimatum was cut short by a new sound, wagons approaching from the east. Through the smoke, Eleanor could see what appeared to be a military supply convoy. Her heart leaped before she noticed something odd about their movement. "Michael," she warned, "those aren't real soldiers." "I know," he replied calmly. "More of Wesley's men, trying to trick us into thinking reinforcements have arrived, but they've made 2 mistakes." "What mistakes?" "First, real cavalry scouts would have flankers out. Second," the Whitworth cracked, and one of the soldiers tumbled from his saddle. "Real soldiers know how to sit a horse properly." The fake convoy scattered, but they'd served their purpose, drawing attention away from Wesley's real move. Eleanor saw men disappearing into the mine entrances, carrying their deadly cargo. "South entrance is hot," she reported, watching through the periscope. "They're moving fast. They know what they're doing." "They should," Michael replied grimly. "Those are probably actual miners Wesley hired. Professional powder men who know exactly where to place charges for maximum effect." Another shot rang out, taking down a man carrying blasting caps. "But they don't know about the water." Eleanor smiled as she finally understood his plan. "The Cave-in of 1868 had flooded several lower tunnels, creating underground reservoirs that Frank Chen's father had mapped while doing laundry deliveries. If they could breach the right walls at the right moment. "Signal Frank," Michael instructed. "Tell him it's time for the dragon to wake up." Eleanor struck the arranged signal. 4 matches quickly extinguished. Moments later, she heard pounding from beneath the streets. Frank Chen and his family had been busy during the siege, positioning charges of their own in key locations. Wesley, still believing he held the upper hand, began his final push. "Charges are set, Mason. Surrender now, or—" The first explosion cut him off, but it wasn't from his men. Frank Chen's charges had breached the reservoir walls. Eleanor heard screaming from below as freezing water flooded the tunnels, driving Wesley's powder men back to the surface in panic. "Now!" Michael's voice carried across the battlefield. "Burke!" The remaining Pinkerton agents opened fire from their positions, forcing Wesley's men away from the mine entrances. Those who'd made it out of the tunnels were soaked and shivering. In the freezing air, their explosives ruined by the water. But Wesley Hawkins hadn't survived this long by giving up easily. "Kill them all," he roared, spurring his horse toward the general store. "Burn every building. Shoot anything that moves." "He's lost control," Eleanor reported, watching his men's formation break down into chaos. Some were following his orders, firing wildly at windows and doors. Others were falling back, having lost their taste for the fight. "Perfect," Michael replied. His next shot caught Wesley's horse in the flank, sending both mount and rider tumbling into the icy street. A wolf without his pack is just another predator. Wesley rolled to his feet, drawing a hidden pistol. "Come down and face me, ghost shot," he challenged, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Man to man, or are you only brave behind that? Scope? You still don't understand." Michael's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This was never about bravery." Another shot knocked the pistol from Wesley's hand. "It was about justice." The Wolf of Wyoming stood alone in the street now. His men either retreated or surrendered. The few who remained loyal were quickly being rounded up by Burke's agents. Wesley turned slowly, trying to track Michael's position, but the smoke and echoes made it impossible. "Justice," Wesley spat. "You think this changes anything? There will always be others like me. Men who understand that civilization is built on violence." "No." Michael's voice was closer now. "Civilization is built on good people standing together. The violence is just what happens when men like you try to tear it down." Eleanor saw movement in her periscope. Michael was executing the final part of their plan. She quickly switched speaking tubes. "Frank, now!" The Chinese laundry's doors burst open, releasing a cloud of steam that mixed with the gun smoke, creating an impenetrable fog. When it cleared, Michael stood in the street, 20 paces from Wesley. Ghost Shot had materialized at last. "Well," Michael asked quietly, "I believe you wanted to face me man to man." Wesley's hand twitched toward his boot, where Eleanor knew he kept a derringer. She raised her Spencer carbine, drawing a bead through a hidden loophole, but Michael's slight headshake stopped her. This was between the two men. The moment stretched like ice about to crack. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the Wolf of Wyoming would make his final, fatal mistake. Time crystallized in the frozen street as Wesley Hawkins faced the legend he'd come to destroy. Ghost Shot Mason stood perfectly still, his Whitworth rifle held loosely at his side, watching the Wolf of Wyoming with the same calculating eyes that had earned him his name during the war. "Well," Michael repeated softly, "you wanted this fight. Here I am." Wesley's face twisted into a savage grin. "Fool, you think because you've scattered my men, flooded my tunnels, that you've won." His hand moved slightly closer to his boot. "I didn't get where I am by fighting fair." "No." Michael agreed. "You got here by being the biggest wolf in the territory, but wolves don't understand one thing." His voice remained calm, almost conversational. "They don't understand why men invented rifles in the first place." Eleanor watched through her scope as Wesley's fingers twitched closer to his hidden derringer. She could end this now with one shot, but she understood why Michael needed to handle this personally. Some ghosts had to be faced head-on. "Last chance, Hawkins," Michael offered. "Surrender to the Pinkertons. Face justice for your crimes. Walk away from this with your life, if not your freedom." Wesley's laugh was cold as the winter air. "Justice? Look around you, Ghost Shot. Look at this miserable town, these weak people hiding in their homes. They don't want justice. They want safety, comfort, someone to protect them from the darkness. I give them that, for a price." "You give them fear," Michael corrected. "Call it protection, call it business. It's still just fear. And fear only works until someone stands against it." The tension in the street was unbearable. Eleanor could see Burke and his remaining agents moving into position, could sense Frank Chen and his family watching from concealed spots. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. "You know what your real mistake was, Mason?" Wesley's voice dripped contempt. "You let them know you had a wife." The derringer appeared in his hand like magic, but he didn't aim at Michael. Instead, he turned and fired at the general store's window, where he'd seen Eleanor's scope flash. The bullet shattered glass, sending fragments spinning in the frozen air. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Michael's Whitworth came up faster than seemed humanly possible, but Wesley was already diving for cover, drawing a second hidden weapon. His men, who'd appeared to retreat, suddenly opened fire from new positions. "Trap!" Eleanor shouted through the speaking tube to their allies. She was already moving, knowing Michael would have anticipated this. Wesley hadn't survived this long by being predictable. "Kill them all!" Wesley commanded as he rolled behind a water trough. "Burn every building! Let them see what defiance costs!" But Michael had predicted this too. As Wesley's men charged forward, they found themselves caught in crossfire from the Chinese laundry and the mining office. Frank Chen's family had prepared for this moment, and the remaining Pinkerton agents hadn't been idle. Burke approached with handcuffs, his remaining agents securing the scene. "Wesley Hawkins," he announced formally. "By the authority of the Pinkerton Detective Agency and the United States government, you're under arrest for murder, extortion, and too many other crimes to list standing here in the cold." As they led Wesley away, Eleanor joined Michael in the street. Around them, townspeople were emerging from their hiding places. Frank Chen and his family were already organizing cleanup efforts, while Dr. Sarah Collins moved among the wounded, treating friend and foe alike. "It's over," Eleanor said softly, touching Michael's arm. "The wolf is caught. The town is safe." "For now," Michael replied, but he smiled as he said it. "There will be others." "Let them come," she said firmly. "They'll find more than just a ghost waiting for them." The sun was breaking through the smoke and clouds, making the snow-covered streets sparkle like diamonds. Ghost Shot Mason had defended more than just a town today. He'd reminded everyone that legends sometimes have substance behind them, and that even the mightiest wolf can fall to determined resistance. But as Eleanor and Michael watched their neighbors beginning to rebuild, both knew that the real victory wasn't in the shooting. It was in the way the town had come together, how ordinary people had found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. The ghost had given them something. Wolves never could. Hope, the legend of Ghost Shot Mason, would grow after this day, but Michael knew the truth. It wasn't his marksmanship that had won the battle. It was having something worth protecting, someone worth fighting for. In the end, that's what separated the ghosts from the wolves, the understanding that true strength comes not from what you take, but from what you're willing to defend. Spring came early to Silver Pine that year, the harsh winter snows melting away to reveal a town transformed. 3 months had passed since the day Ghost Shot Mason faced down the wolf of Wyoming, and the changes were evident everywhere you looked. The general store, its bullet holes now patched and its windows replaced, had become something of a gathering place. with folks lingering to trade stories about the battle they'd witnessed. Eleanor Mason stood behind the counter one bright March morning, watching Michael teach young Jimmy Wells how to properly clean a rifle. The boy had appointed himself the store's unofficial guardian after the battle, and Michael had taken him under his wing, teaching him about more than just marksmanship. "Remember," Michael was saying, his quiet voice carrying the weight of experience, "the rifle is like truth. Keep it clean, treat it with respect, and it'll never fail you when you need it most." The bell above the door chimed as Daniel Burke entered, looking considerably more polished than he had during the siege. The Pinkerton agent had made a full recovery from his wounds, and his success in capturing Wesley Hawkins had earned him a promotion. "Mrs. Mason, Mr. Mason," he greeted them, removing his hat. "Thought you'd want to know. The trial's over. Wesley Hawkins and what's left of his gang will be spending the next 20 years in a federal prison." "And his brother?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Buck Hawkins had been found dead in a Denver saloon 2 weeks after the battle, apparently trying to rebuild his brother's empire and running afoul of other ambitious men. "Won't be troubling anyone else," Burke confirmed. "But that's not why. I'm here." He pulled out an official-looking document. "The agency has a proposition for you both." Michael set down the rifle he'd been demonstrating with, his eyes studying Burke carefully. "We're not looking for work, Mr. Burke. We've built something here we'd like to keep building." "That's exactly why we're interested," Burke replied, spreading the paper on the counter. "The agency's expanding its operations in the territory. We need people who understand that law enforcement isn't just about guns and badges. It's about community, about building something worth protecting." Eleanor moved to stand beside her husband, reading the document. "You want us to train your agents?" "Not just train them," Burke explained. "We want you to help us establish a new kind of presence out here, one that prevents men like Wesley Hawkins from gaining power in the first place. Your store would remain yours, but you'd have official backing, resources, support." Before Michael could respond, Frank Chen appeared in the doorway, his usually calm face showing unusual excitement. "Mr. Mason, Mrs. Mason, you need to see this." They followed him outside to find a crowd gathering in the street. A stagecoach had arrived, but it wasn't the regular mail run. This was a private coach, expensively appointed with armed guards. "Riding escort, railroad commissioners," Frank explained quickly. "Word is they're planning the new spur line, deciding which towns get connected to the main route." The commissioners, 3 well-dressed men from back east, were being greeted by Sheriff Blackburn, but their eyes kept straying to the general store, taking in the now famous sight of Ghost Shot Mason's stand against the Wolf of Wyoming. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Mason," the lead commissioner said as they approached. "Or, should I say, Ghost Shot, we've heard remarkable things about this town's recent transformation." Michael remained typically quiet, but Eleanor stepped forward with her business smile. "Silver Pine has always had potential, sir. Recent events just helped remind folks of that fact." "Indeed." The commissioner surveyed the busy street, noting the new construction, the sense of purpose in people's movements. "We're evaluating several possible routes for the new rail line. Communities that demonstrate stability, growth potential, and strong local leadership tend to be favored." Eleanor caught the subtle emphasis on leadership and glanced at Burke's document still in her hand. Perhaps the Pinkerton agent's timing wasn't entirely coincidental. "Silver Pine is more than stable," she said firmly. "It's thriving. Our store's latest quarterly figures show increased trade throughout the region. Frank Chen's laundry has expanded to include a dress shop. Dr. Collins is training 2 new nurses to help with her growing practice." The commissioner nodded approvingly, but his next words were directed at Michael. "And security. We've heard troubling reports about other towns in the territory. Protection rackets, organized crime. Won't be a problem here, Michael replied quietly. Silver Pine takes care of its own. As if to emphasize his point, young Jimmy Wells walked past, practicing his new rifle cleaning skills on the town's sign. All along the street, townspeople went about their business with the quiet confidence of those who knew they were protected, not by fear or force, but by community. Perhaps, the commissioner suggested, we should discuss this further over dinner. I understand Mrs. Chen's new restaurant serves excellent roast beef. As the group moved toward the restaurant, Eleanor held Michael back for a moment. You're considering Burke's offer, aren't you? He touched the Whitworth rifle that still hung behind the counter, though it hadn't been fired since the battle. A ghost can protect one town, he said thoughtfully. But teaching others, helping them build what we've built here, it would mean more time away, she pointed out, more responsibility. It would mean fewer Wesley Hawkinses, he countered, fewer towns living under the shadow of wolves. He smiled slightly. Besides, you're the real force behind this store. I just keep the books and occasionally handle customer complaints. Eleanor laughed, remembering the last customer complaint, a would-be robber who'd taken one look at Michael cleaning his rifle and decided to become a paying customer instead. Well, if we're going to be training Pinkerton agents and helping the Railroad Commission, we should probably hire some help. Jimmy's getting good with that rifle, and he does need a summer job. They walked toward the restaurant together, passing the spot where Wesley Hawkins had made his final stand. The bloodstains were long gone, the bullet holes plastered over, but the memory remained, not as a shadow, but as a reminder that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together. Inside Chen's restaurant, now expanded and elegantly appointed, the railroad commissioners were already deep in discussion with Burke and Sheriff Blackburn. Frank's father was explaining the town's new drainage system, while Dr. Collins detailed her plans for a proper hospital. You built something special here, Burke told Michael and Eleanor as they joined the group. Something that goes beyond legends and ghost stories. No, Michael corrected quietly, watching his neighbors, his friends, planning their town's future. We just helped everyone remember what they could build themselves. The dinner lasted well into the evening, plans being made, possibilities discussed. Silver Pine was changing, growing beyond its origins as a simple mining town. The railroad would bring new opportunities, new challenges, new threats to face. But as Eleanor looked around the table, she knew they'd face those challenges together. The ghost and his wife had done more than defeat a wolf. They'd helped forge a community. And in the end, that was the greatest protection any town could have. Later that night, as they closed up the store, Eleanor found Michael standing at the window, looking out at their town in the gathering dusk. The last light caught his face, and for a moment she saw both men there, the legendary ghost shot and the quiet bookkeeper she'd married. Having second thoughts? She asked, joining him. About training agents? About helping the railroad bring civilization to the territory? He shook his head. No, just thinking about what you said that day during the battle, about having something worth fighting for. And I realized something. He turned to face her, his eyes soft in the fading light. The ghost never really existed. It was just a name men gave to something they didn't understand. What mattered, what's always mattered, was having someone worth being more than a legend for. Eleanor took his hand, feeling the strength that could steady a rifle or balance, a ledger with equal skill. Outside, Silver Pine settled into the evening, its streets peaceful but not empty. Here and there, citizens went about their business, unafraid of the gathering dark. The wolf was gone, the ghost could rest, and the town they'd helped build would continue growing, protected not by legends or fear, but by the simple truth Michael had taught them all, that ordinary people standing together could face down any threat, and if new wolves came prowling, well, ghost shot. Mason's wife kept a Spencer carbine behind the counter, right next to his Whitworth. Some legends, after all, are best kept in the family. Of course, Michael agreed, returning to his ledger. The railroad brings opportunity, and opportunity attracts predators. But he smiled slightly. Predators can learn new lessons. Later that evening, the town council met in the newly constructed Civic Hall. Eleanor watched with pride as representatives from every part of the community discussed their future. Frank Chen, now serving as deputy mayor, presented plans for a new school. Dr. Collins reported on the hospital's first successful surgery. Sheriff Blackburn detailed his deputy training program, developed with Michael's guidance. This is what really defeated Wesley Hawkins, Michael observed quietly as they listened. Not my rifle, not the Pinkertons. This, people building something together, watching out for each other. Wolves can't fight a united community. Eleanor squeezed his hand. And ghosts? What do they do when peace finally comes? They rest, he replied, but his eyes twinkled, until they're needed again. The meeting was interrupted by Jimmy Wells, no longer the eager boy with a rifle, but a promising young deputy. Telegram from the territorial marshal, he announced. They're seeing similar patterns across the region. Chicago syndicates moving in, testing defenses, looking for weak points. Michael nodded thoughtfully. They think the frontier is still wild, still ruled by fear and force. Time to show them how civilization really works. He turned to Burke, who had joined the council as the Pinkerton liaison. How many agents have completed the new training program? 23, Burke replied. All of them good men, taught to think beyond badges and bullets, just like you wanted. Send them out, Michael instructed, not to fight, but to teach. Show other towns what Silver Pine has learned, that true security comes from community, not fear. Eleanor watched her husband as he outlined his vision. The quiet bookkeeper and the legendary sharpshooter had merged into something new. A builder, a teacher, a protector who understood that the best victories didn't require a single shot. As summer faded into autumn, Silver Pine continued to grow and change. The railroad brought new faces, new opportunities, new challenges, but unlike other boom towns, it grew strong from its roots up. Every new business owner, every settler, quickly learned the town's unspoken rule: stand together or don't stand at all. Michael's training program expanded, sending ripples across the territory. Towns that had once lived in fear of men like Wesley Hawkins began to transform, following Silver Pine's example. The Chicago syndicates found themselves facing not individual targets, but united communities backed by well-trained, vigilant protectors. One evening, as they closed the store, Eleanor found Michael teaching their newest employee, a young woman who'd fled an abusive situation in Chicago, how to handle a rifle. Remember, he was saying in that quiet voice that had guided so many others, the weapon isn't the important part. It's knowing what you're protecting and who's standing beside you when you protect it. The young woman nodded, her hands steady on the rifle. In her eyes, Eleanor saw the same transformation she'd witnessed across Silver Pine. Fear giving way to confidence, isolation replaced by belonging. You're building an army, she told Michael later that night as they sat on their newly added store porch, watching the town's evening activities. No, he corrected gently. I'm helping people build communities. An army fights wars, communities build futures. The last light caught his grey temples, reminding Eleanor how much had changed since that winter day when Wesley Hawkins had learned the true meaning of Ghost Shot's legend. The man beside her had transformed too, finding a way to be both the quiet bookkeeper she'd married and the protector the territory needed. And us? She asked, thinking of the Chicago syndicate's failed attempt to revive Wesley's empire. Are we done with ghosts and wolves? Michael smiled, touching the Whitworth that was never far from reach. A ghost doesn't disappear when the danger passes, he said thoughtfully. It stays, watching, teaching, protecting, not through fear but through wisdom. He took her hand. Besides, every good story needs its guardians. As night settled over Silver Pine, lights twinkled in windows up and down the bustling streets. Music drifted from the new dance hall, mixing with the sound of children playing in the schoolyard. The railroad's evening whistle echoed through the valley, no longer a herald of danger, but a promise of connection to the wider world. The ghost and his wife had built more than just a safe haven. They'd created a blueprint for civilization itself, one that was spreading across the territory like the first light of dawn after a long darkness. And if new wolves came prowling, wearing different clothes and speaking with different accents, they'd find more than just one legendary sharpshooter waiting for them. They'd find a community that understood its own strength, guided by a quiet bookkeeper and his remarkable wife, who had learned that the greatest legends aren't built on fear, but on the simple, unshakable power of people standing together. The story of Ghost Shot Mason and the Wolf of Wyoming had become more than just a tale of good triumphing over evil. It had become a lesson, a blueprint, a promise that echoed across the changing frontier. Some ghosts protect, some legends teach, and some stories never really end. They just change form, like shadows at dawn, guiding the way toward a brighter future. As winter approached once again, bringing with it memories of that fateful battle, Silver Pine received an unexpected visitor. The territorial governor himself arrived on the evening train, his private car marked with the seals of state office. The town turned out to greet him, not with the fearful deference they might have shown a year ago, but with the quiet confidence of people who knew their own worth. Mr. and Mrs. Mason, the governor greeted them at the Civic Hall gathering. Your reputation precedes you, or should I say, your reputations. His eyes twinkled as he looked at Eleanor. I hear Mrs. Mason's aim with that Spencer carbine is nearly as legendary as her husband's. We just protect what's ours, Governor, Eleanor replied diplomatically. The same as anyone else in Silver Pine. That's precisely why I'm here, the governor said, his expression growing serious. What you've built here, it's more than just a successful town. It's a model. The territory is changing, the frontier's closing, and we need examples of how to make that transition work. Michael, who had been characteristically quiet, spoke up. The transition's already happening, sir. Every town that stands up to predators like the Chicago syndicates is part of it. Exactly, the governor's enthusiasm was evident. That's why I'm proposing something unprecedented, a territorial commission on community defense and development with Silver Pine as its headquarters. Training, coordination, support, everything you're already doing, but with official backing and resources. Eleanor watched her husband carefully, seeing him process this opportunity. It would mean more responsibility, she said quietly. More time away from the store. The store's in good hands, Michael replied, smiling at her, and some responsibilities choose us, whether we're looking for them or not. The governor wasn't finished. There's more. The railroad companies are concerned about security along their new routes. They've approached me about establishing a special force, not just guards, but trained professionals who understand both protection and community building. They specifically requested Ghost Shot Mason's involvement in its creation. Frank Chen, who had joined the conversation, offered his perspective. Like the ancient Chinese concept of the guardian teacher, one who protects not just through strength, but through wisdom. As the discussion continued late into the night, Eleanor observed the changes in her husband. The quiet bookkeeper who had once sought only peace had found a different kind of tranquility, the satisfaction of helping others build and protect their own dreams. The next morning brought another reminder of how far they'd come. A group of women from a neighboring town arrived at the store, led by Sarah Collins's sister. They had heard about Eleanor's role in defending Silver Pine and wanted to learn. "We're tired of being seen as victims or hostages," their spokesperson explained. "We want to protect our own communities just like you did." Eleanor glanced at Michael, who nodded approvingly. Soon the store's back room had become an impromptu classroom, with Eleanor teaching not just marksmanship, but the principles of community organization and mutual support that had made Silver Pine strong. "A rifle is just a tool," she told them, echoing Michael's teachings. "Your real strength comes from standing together, from building something worth protecting." As autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson, more changes came to Silver Pine. The Pinkerton office expanded, now serving as a regional headquarters for Burke's new community-based approach to law enforcement. The railroad company, impressed by the town's stability, decided to build their territorial maintenance shops there, bringing more jobs and opportunities. But perhaps the most significant change was less visible. Other towns began sending observers, wanting to learn Silver Pine's secrets. They found no complex strategies, no revolutionary tactics, just the simple, powerful truth that had emerged from that winter battle. That ordinary people, properly organized and motivated, could stand against any threat. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Michael and Eleanor stood on their store's porch, watching the town prepare for winter. The streets were busy with purposeful activity, so different from the fearful quiet of a year ago. "Do you miss it?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "The quiet life we planned?" Michael considered this, absently touching the Whitworth that still hung behind. The store counter. "I thought being ghost shot was about being alone, separate, a legend that lived in whispers and gun smoke." He smiled, watching young Jimmy Wells teach a group of children proper rifle safety. But maybe the real ghost story was about teaching others to stand tall, to face their own wolves. "Speaking of wolves," Eleanor said, nodding toward an approaching figure. It was Burke, carrying a telegram. "News from Chicago," he reported grimly. "The Davidson brothers have been released. Their lawyers got the charges dismissed on technicalities. They're making noise about reclaiming their interests in the territory." Michael absorbed this with his usual calm. "Let them come. They'll find more than one ghost waiting for them now." Indeed, as if to emphasize his point, the evening air cracked with the sound of rifle practice. On the town's newly established range, Dr. Collins was leading a group of women through target drills. At the Civic Hall, Frank Chen was teaching a class on community organization and early warning systems. The sheriff's office was conducting deputy training, using methods Michael had developed. "You've done more than build defenses," Burke observed. "You've created something that multiplies itself. Every person you teach becomes a teacher themselves." Eleanor smiled, remembering that desperate battle a year ago. "That's the real difference between wolves and ghosts, isn't it? Wolves can only destroy. Ghosts—" she squeezed Michael's hand. "Ghosts can inspire." As night fell over Silver Pine, bringing with it memories of that fateful winter, the town settled into its new routines. Lights burned in windows that had once been dark with fear. Music and laughter drifted from homes and businesses. The railroad whistle echoed through the valley, no longer a herald of danger, but a reminder of connection and progress. The ghost and his wife had found something neither had expected, a way to make their legend serve life rather than death, growth rather than fear. And as Silver Pine continued to flourish, its example spreading across the territory like ripples in a pond, they understood that some stories don't need endings. They just need people brave enough to keep writing new chapters, one day at a time, standing together against whatever darkness might come prowling. The first snow of winter fell softly on Silver Pine, covering the town in a blank white canvas. But unlike last year, there was no fear in the quiet, only peace, purpose, and the steady heartbeat of a community that had learned to be its own legend. Ghost Shot Mason's greatest victory hadn't come from his rifle. It had come from showing others that everyone had a ghost inside them, a protector, a teacher, a builder of better tomorrows. And as long as that lesson lived on, no wolf would ever truly triumph. The legend had become a legacy, and the legacy would endure. The morning Thomas Davidson's private train arrived in Silver Pine dawned cold and clear, winter reluctantly giving way to early spring. Eleanor Mason stood at her store window, watching the town prepare for what everyone knew would be a defining moment. The bustling streets held a tension she hadn't felt since the day Wesley Hawkins rode in with his gang of killers. But this threat wore a different face. Through her spyglass, Eleanor studied the approaching train, a magnificent machine of polished brass and gleaming wood, more luxury hotel than locomotive. 3 private cars, she noted, each bearing the Davidson Company's Silver Eagle emblem. Behind it came other trains, systematically blocking every main line into Silver Pine. Quite a show, Michael observed quietly from beside her. He'd been cleaning his Whitworth rifle, not with the methodical preparation for battle as before, but with the calm assurance of a man who'd already set his plans in motion. He wants us to see his power. He's brought an army, Eleanor replied, counting the figures visible through the train windows, but not like Hawkins did. I see at least 6 lawyers, probably a dozen railway agents, and... She paused, studying the men who moved with too much purpose. Maybe 15 security professionals. Real ones, not just hired guns. Michael nodded approvingly at her assessment. Thomas Davidson doesn't believe in leaving things to chance. Unlike his brothers, he understands that real power in the new frontier comes from contracts and credentials, not just cartridges. The station platform had been prepared according to Davidson's exact specifications. Red carpet rolled out, local dignitaries assembled, even a brass band from the new music hall. All part of the performance, Eleanor knew. Davidson wanted to show Silver Pine the difference between his civilized approach and the crude violence of men like Hawkins. Mr. Chen's people in position? Michael asked, though she knew he'd already checked twice. Frank has eyes on every corner of this production, Eleanor confirmed. His father's best men are working the train crew, his cousins are placed among the porter staff, and his sister's serving as a translator for the railways. Chinese laborers. And the independent operators? All waiting for the signal. Davidson thinks he's isolated us by controlling the main lines, but he has no idea how many smaller tracks run through these mountains. She smiled slightly. Amazing what people will share when they're tired of being bullied by Chicago businessmen. The station clock struck 10, and right on schedule, Thomas Davidson's train began its final approach. Eleanor studied the man who emerged onto his private car's observation deck. Younger than she'd expected, handsome in the sharp way of predatory. Birds, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most Silver Pine businesses made in a month. Reminds me of a story my grandfather used to tell, Michael mused, watching through his rifle scope. About a fox who wore fine clothes and promised the chickens he'd protect them from wolves, offered them civilization, progress, partnership. His voice held that quiet calculation Eleanor knew so well. The chickens figured out too late that a predator in a silk vest is still a predator. The train's brakes hissed steam as it came to a perfect stop, positioning Davidson's car exactly at the center of the red carpet. His security team deployed with precise coordination, not obviously armed, but positioned to control every approach. To their employer. Professional, Eleanor noted. Ex-military, maybe. Pinkertons, Michael corrected, or former ones. Burke recognized some of them from his agency days. Men who decided private work paid better than public service. Davidson descended to the platform like a monarch greeting his subjects. Every movement was calculated to project authority tempered by refinement. His smile held just the right mix of confidence and conciliation. Even his handshake seemed choreographed, firm enough to show strength, brief enough to maintain distance. "Silver Pine," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I can't tell you how pleased I am to finally visit the town that's inspired so many colorful stories." His eyes swept the gathered faces. "Though I don't see the legendary ghost shot among you, I trust Mr. Mason received my invitation." Eleanor stepped forward, her store owner's apron contrasting deliberately with the Spencer carbine at her side. "My husband will meet with you when he chooses, Mr. Davidson. Until then, I speak for our business interests." Davidson's smile flickered slightly, the first crack in his perfect facade. He hadn't expected to be addressed by a woman, especially not one so obviously armed. His security team shifted uneasily, hands moving fractionally closer to hidden weapons. "Mrs. Mason," he recovered smoothly, "your reputation does you credit. I hope we can discuss the future of this region like rational people without any need for dramatic displays." "Funny," Eleanor replied, noting how his lawyers were already spreading through the crowd, observing, assessing. "I was about to say the same thing. 3 blocking trains seem rather dramatic for a simple business meeting." Davidson laughed, but his eyes had turned cold. "My dear lady, everything in business is about leverage. I've simply brought some visual aids to demonstrate the new realities of territorial commerce." He gestured expansively at his imprisoned. "Trains. The frontier is changing. The era of individual towns, individual choices, that's ending. Progress demands consolidation, organization, proper management of resources. My company offers Silver Pine a chance to be part of that progress." "By surrendering our independence?" Eleanor challenged. "Accepting your protection like all those other towns you've squeezed with freight rates and restricted access?" Davidson's mask slipped further. "I'd be careful with accusations, Mrs. Mason. I have here," he patted his leather briefcase, "certain documents that might interest you. Records of past arrangements that many of your citizens might prefer stay buried." "You bought what he wanted you to buy," Michael replied, his tone carrying that quiet certainty that had made Ghost Shot legendary. But Hawkins was smarter than that. He kept backup copies, distributed them to trusted allies, insurance against exactly this kind of situation. One of Davidson's lawyers pushed forward, his face pale as he read the falling pages. "Sir, these aren't just Hawkins's records. They're annotated with proof of our own operations. Someone's been tracking our movements, documenting every parallel between his methods and ours. 3 months of planning." Eleanor stepped closer, her Spencer carbine held casually but ready. "Try 2 years. Ever since Wesley Hawkins fell, we've been preparing for men like you. The ones who think putting on a silk vest and carrying a briefcase makes extortion more civilized." Davidson's security chief, a hard-faced man Eleanor now recognized as a former Pinkerton commander, tried to take control of the situation. "The building tops," he ordered his men. "Find Mason. He has to be up high for those shots." But even as they moved to comply, more signals flashed from the surrounding structures. In windows and doorways, on rooftops and balconies, armed figures appeared. Not just Silver Pine's deputies and townspeople, but representatives from a dozen communities up and down the rail line. "Remember what I taught you about ghosts?" Michael's voice carried clearly as Davidson's men realized they were surrounded. "The strongest ones are never alone." A new sound cut through the tension, telegraph keys clicking in the station office. Davidson spun toward the noise, his face darkening as he recognized the coded rhythm. "What are you sending?" he demanded. "Stop them!" But his men couldn't move. From every direction, rifles held them in place, and behind those rifles were faces Davidson recognized. Merchants, miners, ranchers from towns he'd thought safely under his control. "Just sharing some interesting reading material," Eleanor explained, nodding toward the telegraph office where operators were steadily transmitting. "Your letters, Hawkins's ledger, proof of how you've been manipulating rail access and freight rates. By nightfall, every newspaper and governor's office in the territory will know exactly how the Davidson Company does business. You're fools, Davidson spat, his refined accent cracking under pressure. This territory runs on corruption. Everyone knows it, everyone accepts it. You think exposing a few dirty deals will change anything? No. Michael's voice was closer, now, though still hidden. But proving that communities can stand together against men like you, that changes everything. As if to emphasize his point, new whistles sounded in the distance. But these weren't Davidson's blocking trains. These came from the smaller lines, the independent operators he'd dismissed as irrelevant. They were coming from trails and passes his surveyors had never mapped, bringing more allies to Silver Pine's aid. Impossible, Davidson whispered again, watching his carefully constructed scheme collapse. I control all the major rail access. I bought every official line, every primary route. That's right, Frank Chen agreed, now standing with Eleanor. You were so busy buying the big rivers, you'd never noticed all the small streams. My people have been helping build railways in these mountains for generations. Did you think we only worked on the ones your company owned? More telegraph keys were clicking now from multiple offices. Eleanor knew that up and down the territory, operators were sharing not just Davidson's exposed plans, but something more important, proof that towns could resist. That when communities united, even the most powerful predators could be brought down. You're finished in this territory, she told Davidson firmly. By sunset, every bank and business house in Chicago will know how you really built your empire. Every investor will see the risks of backing your schemes. Davidson's hand moved toward his coat, where Eleanor knew he carried a derringer, a gentleman's last resort. But before he could reach it, a shot rang out. The small gun went flying, along with the pocket of his expensive suit. Don't! Michael's voice held that special quiet that made wise men freeze. You're not Wesley Hawkins, and this isn't that kind of story anymore. Finally, Ghost Shot Mason emerged from the shadows, his Whitworth held ready, but not quite aimed. He looked exactly like what he was, a simple shopkeeper who had learned to be something more when his community needed him. You want to talk about progress? Michael asked the shaken businessman. This is progress, communities working together, people helping each other stand against those who'd steal their freedom, whether they're carrying guns or briefcases. Davidson looked around wildly, seeing his security team's professional discipline crumbling as they realized the true extent of their situation. His lawyers were already backing away, trying to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a career-ending scandal. But he had one last card to play. You think this ends here? He snarled, drawing himself up. I still have Hawkins's ledger, the original, names, dates, details of every deal this town and a dozen others made with his organization. By the time I'm done, none of you will be able to do business outside your own doors. Actually, Eleanor smiled, producing a familiar, leather-bound book from behind the station master's desk. You mean this ledger? Davidson's hand flew to his briefcase, fumbling with the locks. When it fell open, his face went pale. Inside was nothing but blank paper, carefully arranged to match the weight and bulk of the real document. As my husband said, Eleanor continued, enjoying the look of total defeat spreading across Davidson's face, ghosts have a way of passing through walls, even steel safes in private railway cars. The legend of Ghost Shot Mason was about to add another chapter, but this time it wouldn't be written in gunsmoke and blood. It would be written in telegraph signals spreading across the territory, in communities standing together, in the power of people who had learned that the strongest defense against any predator was unity. Davidson's eyes darted between the ledger in Eleanor's hands and his empty briefcase, his mind visibly racing through calculations. His security chief leaned in close, whispering urgently, "Sir, we're getting reports from the blocking trains. Independent operators are appearing all along the line. There." He swallowed hard, They're carrying passengers, hundreds of them. Impossible. Davidson breathed, but the increasing sound of whistles in the distance proved otherwise. Those little narrow-gauge lines can't handle that kind of traffic. Amazing what people can accomplish when they work together, Frank Chen observed, now, joined by his father, the old man's eyes twinkling with ancient wisdom. My family helped build most of those little lines. We made sure they could handle more than anyone suspected. Dr. Sarah Collins emerged from the growing crowd, her medical bag in hand, but a rifle slung across her back. Did you really think? Ghost Shot's legend was just about marksmanship, Mr. Davidson. It was always about teaching people to stand together. More figures were appearing now, faces Davidson recognized from his careful research into the territory. The mayor of Crystal Creek, a town he'd thought safely under his control. The banker from Red Rock Valley, who was supposed to be firmly in his pocket. The mining consortium leader from Eagles Pass, whose cooperation he'd bought with expensive bribes. All of you, he snarled, understanding dawning. You were playing along, pretending to submit while you built this. Not all corruption is criminal, Eleanor explained, patting the ledger. Sometimes it's just people pretending to be corrupt while they wait for the right moment to stand up. Your brother Marcus taught us that after he destroyed those 3 towns. Taught us that sometimes the best way to fight a predator is to let him think he's winning. The telegraph keys were still clicking, spreading their message across the territory. But now Davidson could hear responses coming back, confirmations, declarations of support, promises of action against his company's interests. One of his lawyers approached, face ashen. Sir, we're getting wires from Chicago. The banks. They're asking questions about our railway bonds. The stock exchange is getting nervous. Panic spreads faster than truth. Michael's voice came from his new position. Especially when it comes to money. How stable do you think your empire really is, Mr. Davidson? How many investors will stay loyal when they see what's really behind? All those impressive profit reports? Davidson's composure finally shattered completely. Kill them, he screamed at his security team. Kill them all! Burn this miserable town to the ground! But his men didn't move. Their former Pinkerton commander stepped forward instead, removing his gun belt. Sorry, sir, the man said professionally. Our contract specifically prohibits engaging in activities that could be construed as organized crime. The evidence being transmitted. He nodded toward the telegraph office. That would definitely qualify. We're professionals, not criminals. Cowards. Davidson reached for another hidden weapon, but stopped as he heard the distinctive sound of Michael's Whitworth being cocked. Think carefully, Ghost Shot advised quietly, about the difference between dying for something and living to learn. From it, more whistles sounded as the independent trains began arriving. From them poured a tide of humanity, representatives from every town and settlement in the territory. Shop owners Davidson had threatened ranchers he'd tried to squeeze, miners who'd felt the weight of his economic development schemes, but they weren't coming with weapons or thoughts of revenge. They were coming with documents, testimonies, evidence of their own, adding their stories to the growing narrative being spread by the telegraph, creating a tapestry of truth that no amount of money could unravel. You see, Mr. Davidson, Eleanor said softly, a ghost's greatest power isn't in what it can destroy, it's in what it can inspire others to build. She opened the ledger, but what Davidson saw made his eyes widen in fresh shock. Mixed with Hawkins's original entries were new ones, carefully documented evidence of how his own company had followed the same patterns, used the same techniques, and threatened the same freedoms. 2 years of documentation, she explained. Every parallel, every connection, every proof that your civilization was just Hawkins's criminality dressed in a better suit, gathered by ordinary people who learned that watching and waiting were just as important as standing and fighting. And now, Michael added, finally fully emerging to stand beside his wife, All those little streams you ignored are becoming a flood, one that's going to wash away everything you've built. Davidson's face underwent a remarkable transformation, from rage to calculation to something approaching admiration. You really did outmaneuver me, he finally admitted. The ghost and his wife, teaching an entire territory to haunt its own predators. He straightened his torn coat with what dignity remained. So, what happens now? Now? Eleanor exchanged glances with Michael. Now you have a choice, the same choice we've given every other wolf who's come prowling. Adapt or leave. Help build something instead of trying to own it. The territory is changing, Michael agreed. But not into what you thought. Not into a place where money alone equals power. Into somewhere that remembers its ghosts and learns from them. The sun was climbing higher over Silver Pine, illuminating a scene Davidson finally understood. This wasn't just one town's resistance or one legend's stand. This was the frontier itself evolving, learning, becoming something that men like him had never imagined possible. The ghost had taught his greatest lesson yet, that true civilization wasn't built by force or fear, whether it came from a gun or a bank draft. It was built by communities standing together, by people who remembered their own strength. And as the telegraph keys continued their steady clicking, spreading truth like dawn across the territory, Thomas Davidson realized he was witnessing more than just the end of his own empire. He was witnessing the birth of something new, something that would change the frontier forever. Thomas Davidson stood amid the ruins of his ambitions, watching as more independent trains arrived at Silver Pine Station. Each whistle that echoed through the valley marked another piece of his carefully constructed empire crumbling away. But a lifetime of wielding power had taught him never to accept defeat without one final gambit. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" he said softly, his refined accent returning as he regained some composure. The ledger, the telegraph campaign, the independent lines, a masterful strategy. His eyes fixed on Michael. Almost as if you had inside help. Eleanor felt Michael tense slightly beside her. Davidson was probing, looking for weakness, and he'd found something. A thread he thought he could pull. "Inside help?" she asked carefully, though she already suspected what was coming. Davidson's smile was razor-sharp. "Did you really think you were the only ones watching and gathering information these past 2 years? That ledger tells interesting stories about certain railway officials who worked with Hawkins, officials who are still in position today. Officials like..." His voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. "Your brother James, Mr. Mason." The crowd's murmuring stopped. Even the telegraph keys seemed to pause. "James Mason," Davidson continued, warming to his performance. "The quiet bureaucrat who approved Hawkins's original rail contracts, who helped him build the very network I later purchased. Your own brother, Ghost Shot, a man who profited from the same corruption you claimed to fight." Michael's voice, when it came, held that special kind of quiet that made wise men tremble. "Careful, Mr. Davidson. You're treading dangerous ground. Am I? Or am I just pointing out that legends often have darker chapters? That even ghosts have secrets they'd rather keep buried?" He turned to address the gathered crowd. "How many of you knew that Ghost Shot Mason's own brother helped build the system you're all so eager to tear down?" But Davidson had miscalculated. Eleanor saw it in the faces around them, not shock or betrayal, but a deeper understanding. "We knew," Frank Chen said simply. "Mr. Mason told us himself 2 years ago when we started planning this." "James was my brother," Michael acknowledged, his voice carrying clearly. "And yes, he worked with Hawkins, but not for profit or power." He nodded to Eleanor, who produced another document from inside the ledger. "This is James Mason's personal journal," she announced. "The real reason he took that position with the Railway Commission. Every deal he approved, every contract he signed, it was all documented. Every piece of evidence gathered quietly, patiently, building a case that could bring down not just Hawkins, but the entire corrupt system. Understanding dawned in Davidson's eyes. The senior railway officials who backed my purchase of the lines, they knew. They were part of this too. Some corruption isn't criminal, Eleanor reminded him. Sometimes it's just people pretending, waiting for the right moment to act. James taught us that. Taught us that sometimes the best way to fight evil is to let it think it's winning. Then why didn't he expose Hawkins himself? Davidson demanded. Why wait all these years? Because he knew that exposing one man wouldn't be enough, Michael replied. The territory needed to learn to stand together, to build something stronger than any single predator could tear down. His voice softened slightly. James didn't just help build Hawkins's network. He helped build this moment. Every signature, every approval, every seemingly corrupt deal, it was all leading here. More telegraph keys were clicking now, but these weren't just spreading news of Davidson's exposure. They were sharing James Mason's story, adding another layer to the legend of how Silver Pine and its allies had outmaneuvered the Chicago syndicate. Davidson's final gambit had backfired completely. Instead of exposing a weakness, he'd revealed another strength, the power of sacrifice, of playing the long game, of being willing to appear corrupt in service of a greater good. "You still don't understand, do you?" Eleanor asked him quietly. "This was never just about stopping you or exposing corruption. It was about teaching people that real change takes time, patience, and sacrifice. That sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names don't appear in the legend." The former Pinkerton commander, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "Sir," he addressed Davidson formally, "I think it's time we discuss the termination clause in our contract. My men and I, we've seen enough." One by one, Davidson's security team removed their gun belts, placing them carefully on the station platform. They were professionals, and professionals knew when a situation had moved beyond their mandate. "You can't," Davidson's composure cracked again. "I'll pay double, triple." "Some things aren't for sale anymore," the commander replied simply. "This territory's changing. Time to change with it." The telegraph office door opened, and Jimmy Wells emerged with a stack of fresh messages. "Wires from Chicago, Mr. Mason. The banks are calling in Davidson Company loans. The stock exchange has suspended trading in their shares. The governor's ordered an investigation into all their railway contracts." Davidson seemed to physically shrink as his empire's collapse accelerated. But when he spoke again, it wasn't with rage or threats. Instead, his voice held something close to wonder. "All of this," he said softly, gesturing at the gathered crowds, the arriving trains, the clicking telegraphs. "All of it was built on my brother's example, on the idea that corruption could be used against itself, that patience and sacrifice could accomplish what guns and money couldn't." "James understood something you never did," Michael replied. "That true power isn't in what you can take or control. It's in what you can inspire others to build together." Eleanor watched as Davidson absorbed this final lesson. Around them, Silver Pine was transforming from a battlefield into something else, a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they stood united against those who would divide them. The independent trains were still arriving, bringing more witnesses to this. A moment of change, but they weren't just carrying allies now. They were carrying the future, merchants planning new trade routes, farmers discussing cooperative shipping arrangements, miners organizing fair price agreements. "So what happens now?" Davidson asked finally, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier calculation. "To me, to everything I built?" "That depends on you," Eleanor answered. "The territory needs good railways, honest business, real progress. The question is, can you be part of building something instead of just trying to own it?" As the sun climbed higher over Silver Pine, Davidson looked around at what remained of his power. His security team had shifted allegiance to protecting The peace rather than his interests. His lawyers were already approaching the town council, offering to help document the transformation taking place. Even his railway agents were engaged in earnest discussion with the independent operators about coordinating services. The ghost had taught his final lesson, that true civilization wasn't built by force or purchased with gold, but grown through patience, sacrifice, and the unshakable strength of people standing together. And as Thomas Davidson struggled with the choice before him, telegraph keys continued their steady clicking, spreading not just the story of his defeat, but the greater tale of how an entire territory had learned to haunt its own predators. The frontier was changing, becoming something new, something that neither wolves nor ghosts had imagined possible, something built not on fear or force, but on the simple, powerful truth that even the mightiest empire could fall before the united will of ordinary people who refused to be divided. As if to emphasize this transformation, Dr. Sarah Collins emerged from the telegraph office with another revelation. "More messages from Chicago," she announced, holding up a fresh stack of papers. "The Davidson Company's competitors are already reaching out. They want to discuss new partnerships with our independent operators." Davidson's face registered genuine shock. "Morgan himself? The banking consortium? They see the future clearer than you did," Eleanor explained. "A network of cooperating communities, working together instead of being played against each other. Turns out that's more profitable than extortion." The former Pinkerton commander, who had introduced himself as William Thorne, added his professional assessment. "Sir, you should know, this goes beyond Silver Pine. We've had men watching other territories, looking for potential expansion opportunities. What's happening here? It's spreading." "Like a ghost story around a campfire," Michael said quietly. "People learn, they remember, they teach others." Davidson walked to the edge of the platform, staring at the trains that had once represented his power. Each one now carried evidence of his failure, not just to control this territory, but to understand it. "My father," he said suddenly, his voice distant, "used to say that power was like a pistol. Keep it loaded, keep it ready, and people will give you whatever you want." He turned back to face Michael and Eleanor. "But that's not true anymore, is it?" "It never was," Michael replied. "Fear only works until people realize they're stronger together than any weapon." The station was growing more crowded as additional community leaders arrived. Eleanor recognized faces from towns hundreds of miles away, places that had suffered under both Hawkins's crude violence and Davidson's refined extortion. A young woman approached Davidson, her bearing proud despite her simple dress. "You probably don't remember me," she said clearly, "but you foreclosed on my father's ranch last year, said it was just business economics when you forced him to sell to your preferred buyer." Davidson started to speak, but she cut him off. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because what these people have built, this network, this unity, it gave us a way to fight back. The independent operators helped us transport our cattle. The cooperative banks provided fair loans. We bought the ranch back last week." Similar stories were emerging from the crowd, tales of resistance, resilience and reconstruction, communities that had learned not just to defend themselves, but to help others stand strong. "Your brother Marcus destroyed 3 towns, Frank," Chen reminded Davidson, "but they're rebuilding now. Not as isolated settlements easily picked off by predators, but as part of something larger, something stronger." Davidson's lawyers huddled nearby, urgently discussing options, but their client seemed beyond caring about legal strategies. He was watching the scene before him with the fascination of a man seeing color for the first time. "All those years," he mused, "thinking we were bringing progress, civilization, but we were just wolves in different clothing, weren't we? Thinking fear and money could build something lasting." "Fear builds nothing," Eleanor stated firmly. "It only tears me down. Money can help build, but only if it serves the community instead of trying to control it." Jimmy Wells approached with another telegram, this one making Davidson actually laugh. "My brothers," he explained, seeing their questioning looks. "They're disowning me, trying to save what they can of the family reputation by cutting me loose." "Family isn't always blood," Michael observed quietly, thinking of his own brothers. "Sacrifice. Sometimes it's the people who stand beside you when everything else falls away." The sun was high now, the morning's tensions giving way to a different kind of energy. All around the station, people were forming new connections, making plans, building something that transcended individual towns or interests. "I understand now," Davidson said finally. "Why did they call you Ghost Shot? It was never just about marksmanship, was it? It was about haunting people with possibilities, with the idea that they could be more than victims or predators." "Every ghost teaches something," Michael agreed, "if people are willing to learn." Eleanor watched as Davidson struggled with this new reality. The ruthless businessman was giving way to something else, perhaps the man he might have been without. His father's harsh lessons about power and fear. "The railways," he said suddenly, "the ones I controlled. They could be part of this, not as weapons or chains, but as real connections. If—" He paused, genuine uncertainty crossing his face. "If you're willing to teach another wolf new tricks." It was the moment of truth. The gathered crowd held its breath, watching to see how Ghost Shot and his wife would respond to this unexpected surrender. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Michael, seeing in his eyes the same thought that had occurred to her. Sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in destroying an enemy, but in transforming one. "Civilization isn't just about buildings and railways," she said carefully. "It's about choices, about deciding what kind of legacy you want to leave." "James understood that," Michael added. "It's why he worked so long inside a corrupt system. Not to profit from it, but to change it, to show others it could be changed." Davidson straightened his torn coat, a gesture that held more dignity than pretense now. "Then perhaps it's time for the Davidson Company to learn what your brother already knew. That real power isn't in what you can take, but in what you can help others build," Eleanor finished. The telegraph keys kept clicking, spreading not just news of Davidson's defeat, but the story of something larger, a tale of how a ghost and his wife had taught an entire territory that the strongest weapons weren't guns or money, but unity and determination. And as the sun climbed higher over Silver Pine, casting long shadows that seemed to dance like spirits, across the station platform, a new chapter was beginning, not just for one town or one businessman, but for an entire frontier that had learned to believe in something stronger than fear. The ghost had done more than win a battle. He had helped birth a legend that would inspire generations to come, a story about ordinary people who discovered that true civilization wasn't imposed from above, but built from within, one connection at a time. 5 years after Thomas Davidson's empire crumbled at Silver Pine Station, Eleanor Mason stood at her store window, watching a very different kind of arrival. The morning train pulled in right on schedule, its whistle echoing through a valley that had transformed almost beyond recognition. Silver Pine had grown into a bustling hub of commerce and cooperation, its streets lined with new businesses and its people carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of those who had learned their own strength. "Quite a change," Michael observed. From beside her, his Whitworth rifle now displayed prominently above the store counter, more museum piece than weapon these days. "Hard to believe it's the same town that once lived in fear of men like Wesley Hawkins." The train's passengers began disembarking, and Eleanor spotted their expected visitor. Thomas Davidson looked different now, his expensive Eastern suits replaced by more practical Western attire. He'd spent the past 5 years working to transform his railway empire into something that served communities rather than controlling. "Them, Mr. and Mrs. Mason," he greeted them as he entered the store. "Or should I say, Commissioner Mason?" He nodded to Eleanor, acknowledging her recent appointment to the Territorial Railway Commission. "The governor speaks highly of your work in coordinating the new cooperative shipping networks." "It's easier to build things when people work together," Eleanor replied, leading him to their back office. "Speaking of building, how are the new branch lines progressing?" Davidson spread out a map on their conference table. Another change. From the days when this room had been just for bookkeeping, the independent operators have been instrumental in reaching smaller communities. Frank Chen's engineering suggestions about using narrow-gauge tracks in difficult terrain have saved us fortunes while expanding access. Michael studied the map thoughtfully. "And the Davidson Foundation's educational initiatives?" 17. "New schools opened this year alone," Davidson reported proudly. "Each one teaching not just reading and figures, but the history of how this territory learned to stand together. Your brother James features prominently in those lessons." Eleanor touched the framed photograph on the wall. James Mason in his railway commissioner's uniform, the man who had sacrificed his reputation to help build a better future. He would have appreciated that, the idea that his story is helping teach new generations about the power of patience and unity. The door chimed as more visitors arrived. Frank Chen, now Silver Pines mayor, entered with his father and William. Thorne, the former Pinkerton commander who had chosen to stay and help build something new. "The quarterly council meeting is about to begin," Frank announced. "Representatives from 23 communities are waiting in the Civic Hall, including 3 towns that used to be under my brother Marcus's control," Davidson added quietly. "They're among our strongest supporters now of the cooperative development initiatives." As they walked to the Civic Hall, Eleanor observed how naturally Davidson fit into their group. The wolf had truly learned new ways, transforming his predatory instincts into protective ones. His business acumen now served to strengthen communities rather than exploit them. The Civic Hall itself was a testament to how much had changed. Built with funds from the Davidson Foundation but designed by local architects, it represented the blend of Eastern resources and Western independence that characterized the new frontier. Inside, the council chamber was filled with familiar faces. Dr. Sarah Collins, whose medical practice had expanded into a regional hospital network, Jimmy Wells, now a senior marshal coordinating community defense training across the territory, even old Pete Sullivan, the former undertaker who had become an unlikely but effective administrator of the cooperative banking system. "Before we begin," Davidson addressed the gathering, "I have news from Chicago. The banking consortium has approved our proposal for expanded credit access to smaller communities. They're convinced that our cooperative model actually reduces risk while increasing returns. Because when communities support each other," Eleanor explained to the newer representatives, "everyone prospers. The ghost taught us that, though not in the way anyone expected." Michael, who had been characteristically quiet, spoke up. "Speaking of teaching, the Territorial Marshal's Office reports that violent crime has dropped significantly since we implemented the Community Defense Network. Turns out criminals are less likely to target towns that stand together, and legitimate businesses are more likely to invest in them," Davidson added. "My brothers thought I was mad 5 years ago when I reorganized the company. Now they're trying to implement similar cooperative models in other territories." The meeting proceeded, dealing with the practical matters of coordinating rail schedules, managing shared resources, and planning for future growth. But underneath the mundane, business ran a deeper current, the sense that they were part of something unprecedented, a new kind of civilization built not on force or fear, but on unity and mutual support. Later that evening, as the sun set over the expanded town, Eleanor and Michael hosted a smaller gathering at their home above the store. Davidson raised a glass to the assembled group. To the ghost who taught a wolf new tricks, he proposed, and to his wife, who showed us all that true strength isn't in what you can take, but in what you can build together. To James, Michael added quietly, who understood that sometimes the longest road is the surest one. As night settled over Silver Pine, Eleanor stood on their balcony watching the lights of the town, not just their town now, but the hub of something larger, something that had grown beyond any single community or legend. Besides, Davidson added, joining them on the balcony, the best legends aren't about the past. They're about showing people what's possible in the future. The night air carried the sound of trains in the distance, not signs of threat or isolation. No, but connections to a wider world, a world that was learning from what had been built here in Silver Pine. We'll need to be vigilant, Eleanor mused. There will always be those who think force or money can buy what can only be built through cooperation. That's why we teach, Michael replied. Why do we keep the ghost's lessons alive? Not just about marksmanship or strategy, but about the power of standing together. And why do some of us former wolves help guard what's been built? Davidson added, to remind everyone that change is possible if you're willing to learn new ways. As they gathered inside for dinner, Eleanor looked around the table at their unlikely family, the ghost and his wife, the reformed wolf, the Chinese mayor, the Pinkerton commander turned community defender. Each had played a part in transforming not just Silver Pine, but the very idea of what civilization could mean on the frontier. The legend of Ghost Shot Mason had evolved into something far more powerful than a tale of supernatural marksmanship. It had become a story about how ordinary people could stand together against any threat, about how patience and unity could accomplish what guns and money never could. And as Silver Pine's lights twinkled in the gathering darkness, Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. The ghost's greatest legacy wasn't in the battles he'd won, or the enemies he'd defeated. It was in the future he'd helped build, a future where communities stood together, where wolves could learn new ways, and where civilization grew from the ground up, nurtured by the unshakable strength of people who had learned to believe in something greater than fear. The frontier had changed, and with it, the very nature of power. And somewhere in the whisper of wind through mountain passes, in the rhythmic clicking of telegraph keys, in the whistle of trains connecting communities once divided, the ghost's lesson lived on. That the strongest legends aren't written in gunsmoke or blood, but in the quiet courage of people who dare to stand together and build something new. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.